Hi, class. Father Matt here. I'm doing something a little different. I'm recording the class on Monday evening because I have to go to Dallas in the morning, and so I won't be able to have a live YouTube session as I've done in the past. Forgive me for that. What we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce Aristotle to you. Remember that all of my lecture notes are on my Google Drive, and I put that link up on Canvas again. It's been on Canvas many times. I will try to put it in the show notes of the YouTube video as well. But if you get lost, just know that the lecture notes are on my Google Drive. And we're going to look at Aristotle today. We're moving past Plato. So far in the class, we've talked about Heraclitus and Parmenides. We've talked about Plato. We've talked a little bit about Homer and the Greek gods. I'm looking for an opportunity to circle back around and talk about the Greek gods, partly because partly because Homer and the Greek gods that come to us in the form of a story, right? A mythos. What is the opposite of mythos? The opposite of mythos is logos. And one of the things that I want to do in this class is to take mythos and logos and put them together in dialectic. And so I feel like we actually need to spend a little more time talking about mythos, and in particular about Homer and the Greek gods. We haven't really covered them yet, and so I'm looking for an opportunity to squeeze them in, and I want to do that in the next couple of weeks before we move to Descartes and before we say goodbye to the ancient world, all right? But we've looked at Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Plato. What we're doing now is we're moving on to Aristotle, and the very first thing I want to say, and this is Roman numeral 1 on my lecture notes, is I want to say a word about literary output. I want to talk about how Aristotle's writing style is very different from Plato's writing style. And I think that we've probably already talked about this some in the course of the semester, but I want to talk about it a little more, and it's actually connected to what we were just talking about, because as we've seen in the class so far, Aristotle very much writes in terms of a story. He very much writes in terms of a story, and that's kind of like Homer and the Greek gods, right? I mean, when did I say Aristotle? I meant Plato. Plato writes in terms of a story, and we've seen that. We've read the Euthyphro, we've read the Apology, and both of these works are stories. They have characters like Socrates and Euthyphro. Socrates is saying stuff, he's doing stuff, he's a character in a story. When Plato writes, he writes in the form of a story. That's why they're called dialogues. A dialogue is a dramatic production that involves things like plots and characters and settings. When Aristotle writes, he doesn't write in terms of a story, he writes in terms of a system. Aristotle is a much more systematic thinker than than Plato is, and that's a big deal, and that's about their literary output. Now, I want to say one other thing about literary output. The basic point right now is that Plato writes in terms of myth or story or narrative. Aristotle writes in terms of system. Aristotle is trying to be more scientific than Plato is, okay? But I want to say one other thing about this, and it has to do with time. Because you see, when Plato writes in a more narratival form, when he writes in terms of narrative, there's a key way in which that's different from a system, okay? And I want you to think about your geometry textbook in high school. Now, you probably don't remember your geometry textbook, but probably Everyone in the class, or at least most people in the class, did take geometry in high school. And so you probably have a vague notion of what I'm talking about. But if you think about your geometry textbook in high school, it's not like there's a story. It's not like your geometry textbook is a story. It's not like there's a plot. Think about what a plot is. In a plot, first this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, right? Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and da 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 da. That's a plot. It's a story, right? Once upon a time, there was a man named Abraham, and Abraham loved God. And one day God came up to Abraham and said, Abraham, I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your father and mother and go to a land that I will show you. See, that's a story. First this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And the point that I want to make to you right now is that stories unfold over time. Now, it might not be a literal time, it might be an imaginary time, or you might say that within the story, there is a time that unfolds. You might think of it in terms of fictional time. But the point is that in a story or a narrative or a mythos, things unfold over time. There's a kind of development that takes place over time in a story. And the word for that is diachronic. See, what we say is that stories take place diachronically. They unfold over time. The prefix dia, D-I-A, means through, like a diaphragm for all you nursing students. What is a diaphragm? It's a part of your body through which air flows. The prefix dia means through, and chronic, chronos, is time. So when we say that a story is diachronic, what we mean is that it unfolds over time. First this happens, then this happens, then this happens. That's closely related to the notion of plot. And the point is that a plot takes place over time. But if you think about a system, like, for example, your geometry textbook, that doesn't take place over time. Now, I know that it's true that it takes time to learn the system. Yes, that's true. You have to master the concepts in chapter 1 before you can go on to the more advanced concepts in chapter 5 and in chapter 10. Yes, that's true. It takes time to learn the system. That's true. But it's not like in your geometry textbook, there's a plot. It's not like there's events that happen in a narrative world that take place over time and that unfold. No, no, no. Instead, the goal of a geometry textbook is you're supposed to see the whole system in one fell swoop. You're supposed to see the system in its entirety as a whole. That's the idea behind science. Science isn't a story that unfolds over time. No, it's a structure. It's a structure that you're supposed to grasp as a whole, okay? It's kind of like a map. I mean, if you look at a map of Texas, now it's true that you can look at East Texas, or you can look at the Panhandle, or you can look at South Texas. That's true. But when you're looking at a map of Texas, you're supposed to appreciate the state of Texas as a whole. You see, the state of Texas on a map is a structure, and that's how science is. I mean, a biologist is someone who grasps and understands biology as a whole. It's not a story. It doesn't have a plot. And that's how Aristotle writes. Aristotle very much writes in terms of a system. He's wanting you to be able to grasp certain structures and certain systems as a whole. And y'all, the word that we use for that is synchronic, not diachronic. Diachronic goes along with narrative, right? This idea that first Abraham does this, or first Harry Potter does this, and then he gets in trouble with his mean stepdad, and then he meets Ron and Hermione, and then he kills Voldemort, right? I mean, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and this happens. In the story of Harry Potter, that's diachronic. It takes place through time. But in Aristotle's way of writing, which is more systematic, more scientific, it's not the case that this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and then this happens. in and through time. No, rather you're supposed to grasp the system as a whole. That is not called diachronic, that's called synchronic. That prefix syn, S-Y-N, means together. So in a diachronic text or a diachronic production, the action takes place in and through time, but in a synchronic structure or a synchronic work or a synchronic system, you're seeing everything with time, okay? You're seeing it as a whole. There is no temporal unfolding. Now, it's true that it takes time to learn it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the structure itself. In the structure itself of a system, there is no unfolding, okay? So think about, for example, the structure of an atom, okay, which would be a scientific structure. There's no story involved there. There's no plot involved there, right? You're just looking at the structure. It could even be as simple as an abstract representation of a water molecule, H2O. If you were to Google water molecule H2O and click on images, you can see these abstract structures. Those are not stories. Those are not things that have a temporal development. It's a big structure that you're supposed to grasp as a whole. That's true for the structure of an atom. It's true for the structure of a water molecule. It's also true for the structure of the solar system. If you think about a map of the solar system, you're looking at the whole thing as a structure. That's called synchronic. It's with time. There is no movement through time. Rather, it's a systematic structure, okay? So Plato produces works that are diachronic. Aristotle produces works that are systematic, scientific, or synchronic, okay? And that's a key distinction that I want to drill into your minds in terms of a key difference between Plato on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. And one of the things that we learn from this, one of the upshots of this, one of the ways in which this matters is that, as we're going to see later in the class, Plato is much more friendly to narrative, whereas Aristotle doesn't like narrative. Plato is much more open to the idea that truth can come to us by way of myth. Aristotle is much less open to that, okay? And let me just plant a seed in your mind to the effect that what that means is that Plato is going to be more open to religion than Aristotle is, okay? Why? Why do I say that? Well, think about the Bible, think about the Quran, think about the Hebrew scriptures. Those are narratives, right? The Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are not systems, those are stories, right? So what you can see is that Aristotle is more closed to that sort of thing because he thinks in terms of structure. He thinks in terms of science. He thinks in terms of system. Whereas Plato is more open to the idea that we can learn things from stories, and that would include the stories of the scriptures, the Old Testament, the Quran, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, okay? Y'all, that's my first point about literary output. You will probably see something about that on a quiz sometime soon. You will have a quiz on Aristotle, probably not this week, but probably next week or the following week. That'll be your second quiz. And this notion of diachronic versus synchronic could likely show up on that quiz. But moving to Roman numeral 2 now on my lecture notes, what I wanted to do now is to read a paragraph from page 3 of the Barnes book. You'll remember that the text that you're supposed to be reading right now for the Aristotle portion of the course is a book by Jonathan Barnes called Aristotle, A Very Short Introduction. That is on your reading schedule. It's also one of the required texts listed on the syllabus. And what I wanted to do was just to read a paragraph from page 3 of that book. It's the only full paragraph on page 3, and I'm going to read that, okay? Aristotle did not think himself singular in possessing such a desire. even if he pursued his object with singular devotion, for he affirmed that all men by nature desire to know. All men by nature desire to know, and he claimed that each one of us is, most properly speaking, to be identified with his mind, so that life, a fully human life, is an activity of the mind. In an early work, the Protrepticus, or Exhortation to Philosophy, Aristotle announced that the acquisition of wisdom is pleasant. All men feel at home in philosophy and wish to spend time on it, leaving all other things aside. The word philosophy designates etymologically the love of wisdom, and a philosopher in Aristotle's book is not a cloistered academic engaged in remote and abstract speculation. He is someone who searches for knowledge of things human and divine. In one of his later works, the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that happiness, that state of mind in which men realize themselves and flourish best, consists in a life of intellectual activity. Is not such a life too godlike for mere mortals to sustain? No, for we must not listen to those who urge us to think human thoughts since we are human, and mortal thoughts since we are mortal. Rather, we should, as far as possible, immortalize ourselves, and do all that we can to live by the finest element in us. For if in bulk it is small, in power and worth it is far greater than anything else. And then the next paragraph says, a man's proper aim is to immortalize himself to imitate the gods. Okay, y'all, that is an amazing paragraph. And there's at least 3 or 4 concepts, themes, motifs in that paragraph that I want to point out to you. The first one is this notion of desire. Aristotle says, and by the way, this is in his book, The Metaphysics. I'm going to hold these books up for you in a moment, but this is Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics. At the very beginning of the Metaphysics, Aristotle says that all men by nature desire to know. See, for the ancients, knowledge isn't just some abstract thing. It's something that is built into us as part of our human nature, something that we have a desire to achieve. Aristotle would say that the human desire to know is just as strong as the human desire to eat or to drink or to have sex or to rest. For Aristotle, what it means to be human is a desire to understand things. There's something about grasping truth for Aristotle that is deeply, deeply satisfying. It's something that we have a desire for. Secondly, in that paragraph, Jonathan Barnes reminds us that for Aristotle, the notion of mind is very, very important. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at later in the next couple of weeks is Aristotle's schema of the soul. We're going to talk about Aristotle's tripartite soul. You've got the mind at the top, then you have appetite and sense perception in the middle, and then at the bottom, you have the vegetative soul. And we're going to talk about all that in the next couple of weeks. But one of the things that you need to understand about Aristotle is that for Aristotle, human beings are body and mind. We call that a psychosomatic unity, okay? That word psycho is from the Greek word psyche, P-S-Y-C-K-E, psyche. We've talked about that already in the class. That's the word from which we get our modern word psychology. Psyche or psyche means soul. Soma is body. So psychosomatic is soul and body put together. We speak of a psychosomatic unity. We've already talked in the class, and we're going to talk more in the class about how for Aristotle, all objects in the world are composites of form and matter, okay? So for example, a tree or a frog or a chair, those are all objects that are composites of form and matter. Aristotle would say that there's the form of the tree or the frog or the chair, and then there's the matter of the tree or the frog or the chair. We've already talked about form a little bit in terms of Plato. We talked about how for Plato, the forms are these metaphysical entities that really exist, that are more than just mental concepts. But now we're looking at the notion of form for Aristotle, and what Aristotle says about form. He agrees with Plato that form is closely connected to the notion of essence. So if you want to know the essence of a frog or a tree or a chair, you need to know the form of the frog or the tree or the chair. Plato and Aristotle agree with that. But what Aristotle wants to say is that the form is closely connected to the matter. The form and the matter for Aristotle always go together. For Aristotle, unlike Plato, there's no such thing as a form that's not connected to matter. We could say that for Aristotle, the form is immanent to the object, okay? And for a human being, and actually for all living organisms, there's a special word for form, and it is the word soul, okay? So the form of a human being, or indeed any living organism like a frog or an oak tree, the form of that thing is the soul. And yes, Aristotle does believe that oak trees have souls. We're going to talk about that more. But for a living organism, including a human being, the form is the soul. The matter is the body. Okay, so you've got form and you've got matter, and these things go together. And what I'm trying to say to you right now is that Aristotle does believe that human beings are body and soul and body, that's true, but he thinks that most properly and most truly what we are is mind, which is a particular faculty of the soul, a particular part of the soul. That's what Barnes is saying in that paragraph. That the mind of the human person is the highest dimension of the human person, and it is that element in us which is most divine. And that is why when Jonathan Barnes talks about happiness, and when Aristotle talks about happiness, and remember that's that Greek word eudaimonia, we've talked about that word several times in this course already. When Aristotle talks about happiness, the Greek word there is eudaimonia. And Barnes rightly says that for Aristotle, eudaimonia is a matter of the mind. It is the mind in the human person for Aristotle that is most divine. And so the purpose of what it means to be a human person, last class, we talked about the telos, or the person, the purpose of the human being. And what Barnes is saying rightly is that for Aristotle, achieving our purpose involves our mind. And in particular, it involves that human activity, which is highest in man or most divine in the human person, namely contemplation, okay? So y'all, you remember last class when we were talking about the apology, we were talking about the objective purpose of the human being for Plato and Aristotle. We were saying that the highest activities are done for their own sake and not in a utilitarian way, not as a means to an end. In other words, for someone like Plato or Aristotle, it would be better to do yoga or to pray or to meditate or to worship God for its own sake, and not so that you can take a picture of yourself and post it on Instagram, right? It's better to do an activity for its own sake than it is to do an activity as a means to some other external end, as a means to some other end, right? Well, we're seeing the same thing here. That's exactly what Jonathan Barnes is saying in this paragraph. He's saying that what it means to be truly happy, what it means to achieve eudaimonia, what it means to be truly fulfilled as a human being, pertains to the mind. It pertains to that which is most divine in us, namely contemplation. Okay, so contemplation is a super important thing for Aristotle. And it is for Aristotle, it is that activity which lends itself most fully to happiness, okay? So what Aristotle wants to say is, baking bread does not make you happy. Now, there's a time and a place for it, but baking bread does not make you happy. Learning algebra does not make you happy. Building a treehouse does not make you happy. Drinking a beer does not make you happy. Having sex with someone doesn't make you happy. The thing that makes you happy or fulfilled for Aristotle is contemplation, okay? That's what it means to be fully human. That's what it means to achieve eudaimonia. That's what it means to become divine, or at least to become as close to God as human beings are capable of becoming, okay? And y'all, the last phrase that I want to pick out of that paragraph on page 3 of the Barnes book is this phrase, immortalize ourselves. How can human beings immortalize ourselves? How can we become divine? One of the ways that Aristotle wants to say that we immortalize ourselves is by having children, right? This is a way in which biological organisms, be it a human being or a frog or a tree, we have children and we pass on our DNA and we propagate the species in that way. And that's kind of like striving to become immortal. All of that is true for Aristotle. But the main way that we immortalize ourselves for Aristotle is through contemplation, okay? And I want to summarize that paragraph. This is Roman numeral 2 on the outline, my lecture notes. I want to summarize by saying that for Aristotle, true life, what it means truly to be alive, is an activity of the mind called contemplation. That would be my summary of that paragraph. And contemplation is something that satisfies our desires for Aristotle. And I just think that that is very, very interesting. And that's something that's an idea that will reverberate throughout the history of philosophy and theology. But I think that it's something that for modern secular people is kind of difficult to understand. All right. For Aristotle, what it means to be truly alive is to contemplate, and that is an activity of the mind, okay? So y'all, we've talked about the literary output of Aristotle versus Plato. We've talked about how for Aristotle, contemplation is super, super important. Getting that idea out of that paragraph on page 3 of the Barnes book. Roman numeral 3, I'm still introducing Aristotle. Roman numeral 3 is something that I call Aristotle's curriculum. Now, let me back up a little bit. We've already talked in this class, we've already talked about how for ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, philosophy was not some abstract activity that a scholar does in an ivory tower. No. For ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, philosophy is a way of life that's lived out in community, right? We talked about this a little bit. This is why both Plato and Aristotle had schools, because they understood that the life of philosophy involves community and learning with one another and living with one another. And by the way, in these schools, they would even do things like exercise. Have you ever noticed how in public schools, even today, you have PE, you have physical education. You also have sports like football and basketball. All of those things can be traced all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and the schools that they had. These schools would often have a building called a gymnasium, and that is where they would do the exercises, okay? And that's something that we see even in our modern society. You can go to a high school in your city, and you can go into a building called the gymnasium. That goes all the way back to 5th century Athens. It goes all the way back to the schools of ancient philosophy, okay? But when it comes to Aristotle's curriculum, he had 3. So if you think about a curriculum for mathematics, you might think of it like, okay, first you've got arithmetic, and then you have maybe geometry, and then you have algebra, right? That would be kind of like a basic, very, very basic curriculum. You've got this, then you've got this, and you've got this. Arithmetic might be a prerequisite to geometry, and geometry might be a prerequisite to algebra, right? So you can see how each of these different disciplines, arithmetic, geometry, and algebra, they're connected, right? They go together. This one leads to this one presupposes this one. They're connected in a system of science. Remember, that word science just means knowledge. See previous lectures about Daedalus and his roving sculptures. But you've got that idea of curriculum, arithmetic, geometry, and then algebra. Well, it's the same way with Aristotle. Aristotle has a curriculum, or you might call it an order of learning. And the most basic level, the most basic body of knowledge that Aristotle says, start with this, is logic. And then after you master logic, for Aristotle, you can move up to something called physics, but I need to explain that. And then after you master physics, you can move up to something called metaphysics, and I need to explain that. But let's start with logic, okay? Y'all, this is a work of Aristotle. It's actually several works: the Categories, On Interpretation, and the Prior Analytics. These are works of logic, and it's amazing that Aristotle basically invented the study of logic. If you want to know what logic is, I do not have time to go into great detail on this at all, but you might think of logic like this. Let me give you a basic syllogism just for a taste of what logic is like. Probably the most famous syllogism in the world goes like this. You've got premise one, premise two, and then a conclusion. Premise one, premise two, and then a conclusion, okay? Premise one is all men are mortal. Premise two, which is called the major premise, is Socrates is a man. And then you've got the conclusion. Anyone want to guess what the conclusion is? The conclusion would be Socrates is mortal. So premise number one, all men are mortal. Premise number two, Socrates is a man. And then the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. That would be called a syllogism. That's kind of what logic is like. I wouldn't want anyone to have to take a symbolic logic class like I did at the University of Texas in the late 90s. Man, it was difficult. But that's just a little taste of what logic is like. And for the purposes of this intro to philosophy class, what I want you to know is that Aristotle invented that. Now, that might not be 100% true, but it's 98% true. Prior to Aristotle, no one had developed a system of logic, including Plato. Plato has some hints at logic, but nothing like a developed system that Aristotle had. And what Aristotle wants to say is that if you want to study philosophy, if you want to be a philosopher, you need to start with logic. Once you master logic, then you can move or advance or graduate to the next item in the curriculum, which is what he calls physics. Now, y'all, I need to explain this word physics, and I've probably already talked about it in the class. It comes from the Greek word physios. I'm gonna spell that. I wish that I had a marker board, but alas, I don't. So I'm just gonna write, the word physios, and I don't even have a marker that's readily available. P-H-Y-S-I-S. P-H-Y-S-Y-S, the word physios, which is where we get the word physics, okay? Now, let me ask you a question. What do you think of when you hear the word physics? Now, most people in our day and age, when they hear the word physics, they think of things like torque or motion or speed, you know? What is speed? It's or velocity. It's distance over time. Yeah. See, that's physics. Some people might think of atoms. Other people might think of things like string theory. But when you and I think of physics, we tend to think of things that are not alive. We tend to think of things that are inorganic. Atoms are inorganic. Um, Molecules bumping into each other are inorganic. But y'all, when Aristotle talks about physics, he means something very different. He means nature. Now, I don't know exactly what you think of when you think of nature, but I think that when most people think of the word nature, they think of things that are alive, things that are moving, organisms. When Aristotle talks about physics, he basically means things that move, primarily things like plants that move. By the way, do plants move? When was the last time you saw an oak tree walking? Well, plants don't move in terms of location. They don't move in terms of locomotion, but they do move in terms of growth, right? So in that sense, plants move and they change. When you hear that word change, you might think of Heraclitus talking about how all is flux. Everything changes. That is the realm of physis or physics for Aristotle. When Aristotle talks about physics, he means things that change, things that move. Plants move, they grow. They start out as a seed, and then they become a little shoot, and then they become 2 feet tall. I think that in a previous class, I talked about bamboo and how bamboo grows so fast that you can almost see it growing. I mean, sometimes bamboo will grow like 1.5 inches in a 24-hour period. That is so fast that you can almost see it. Even if you can't quite see it, you could record it on a video and speed it up with a time lapse, and you could see the thing growing. See, that's motion. That's growth. That is the kind of thing that Aristotle's talking about when he talks about physics. He says, first you have to master logic. Then once you do that, you can go on to physics, which is about the realm of change and growth. Plants, animals, and yes, human beings. Now, side note, Aristotle also includes things like rocks in his realm of physics or physis. Why is that? Well, it's because in Aristotle's mind, rocks move. Now, you and I tend to think, oh yeah, rocks fall because of gravity, but that's not how Aristotle saw it. For Aristotle, a rock is earth, because borrowing from Empedocles, Aristotle believed in 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Earth, wind, fire, and water. He got those from Empedocles. We're going to talk more about those in coming lectures, probably beginning next time. Empedocles was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, along with Heraclitus and Parmenides. But Aristotle borrows from Empedocles the 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. And he wants to say that a rock would be earth. And Aristotle says that it is the nature of earth to go down. He didn't think of it in terms of gravity. He almost thought of it like the natural inclination of earth is to go down. By the way, the natural inclination of fire is to go up. So you see, both fire and earth are examples of things that move, and it's things that move that are the realm of nature or physis or physics, okay? So for physics, Aristotle is thinking about stuff that moves, plants, animals like lions. By the way, do lions grow and then decay? Yes, they do. Plants grow and decay. Lions grow and decay. Animals grow and decay. See, the realm of generation and corruption, aka growth and decay, that's the realm of physics. That's the realm of nature. That's the realm of physis for Aristotle. He does include things like rocks, but it's because he thinks that rocks have a natural inclination to move. He doesn't say that they're alive. He doesn't even say that they have souls, but he does say that, like fire has a natural inclination to move upward, earth, rocks, has a natural inclination to go down. So he includes those in the realm of nature, in the realm of Confucius, okay? See, we're talking about Aristotle's curriculum or his order of learning. He says you start out with logic and then you graduate to physics, but then you move on to metaphysics, okay? Now, I want to talk a little bit about this word metaphysics because there's a couple of ways to look at this, and they're closely related. First off, take that prefix meta, M-E-T-A. One of the meanings of that prefix is beyond. So whatever metaphysics is, it's beyond physics, okay? And y'all, there's a story connected to this. There's an ancient myth or an ancient story that says that somewhere in the ancient world there was a bookshelf, much like the bookshelf behind me right now. And on that bookshelf, there were lots and lots of different books, including some books of Aristotle. And so you had this book by Aristotle, this book by Aristotle right here, and then you had this next book by Aristotle, which was called The Physics. But then the next book on the shelf was called, well, we don't know what this book is called. We're just going to call it the book that's after the physics, or the book that is beyond the physics. See, meta, the prefix meta, can mean after or beyond. And literally, there was a book on a bookshelf in the ancient world somewhere, maybe in a monk's library, who knows, where this book came right after the physics, and so they called it the metaphysics. And that's one of the ways that this book, the metaphysics, got its name. But there's another meaning of that term metaphysics, and I want to talk about that for just a couple of minutes. Before we move on to Roman numeral 4, because right now we're still on Roman numeral 3 of my lecture notes. We're talking about Aristotle's curriculum, or his order of learning. First, you've got the logic, and then you graduate to physics or nature, and then you go finally to metaphysics. And I want to talk about metaphysics for a little while, because not only does the term metaphysics derive from the fact of the location of the book on the bookshelf, that is probably something that will pop up on a quiz or a final exam. Not only does this work derive its name from the location on a bookshelf, but also because what Aristotle is writing about in this book, the Metaphysics, is not something that is confined to the realm of nature, okay? And there's lots of different ways to think about this, but for the purposes of my class, the main thing that we want to talk about in terms of Aristotle's metaphysics is what he says about God, okay? Now, I hope you can see that even for Christians and Muslims and Jews, God is something that is beyond nature. God is not something that is simply a natural creature, right? God is not a giraffe. God is not a human being simply. God is not a frog. God is not a rock. God is the creator of all things. God is outside of the world. God is beyond the world. And the fancy word that we use to talk about that, y'all, is the word transcendence. Transcendence. Christians and Muslims and Jews believe that God is transcendent. Now, that's not the only thing that they believe about God, but they do believe that about God. God is transcendent. In other words, God is outside of the world. God is beyond nature. God is totally other. And that is what Aristotle is saying in this book. This is a very difficult book to understand. It's a very interesting book. It's a very complicated book. But the conclusion to which Aristotle is driving in this book is an argument about God. In fact, one of the ways that Aristotle refers to this work, this text, is he calls it theology. He calls it theologia. I just told you one of the ways that this book got its name. It has to do with its literal location on a bookshelf. It came after the physics. Aristotle does not call this work the Metaphysics, but he does call it theologia. Theologia. He calls it theology. Why? It's because that's what this book is driving at. This book is a long and extended article, long and extended argument on the part of Aristotle to make a case for the existence of God. And you see, the main point that I want to say right now is that for Aristotle, God is beyond nature. It's not just that the book was lined up and situated on a bookshelf after physics. It's also that for Aristotle, God, theos, is beyond nature, outside of nature. God is transcendent. This book is many things, but one of the things that this book is an extended argument for the existence of God, which is something that is outside or beyond nature. Okay, y'all, I'm almost out of time. I want to say a couple of more things about this book, The Metaphysics, and then I want to introduce one other topic in this lecture before I close. And the last thing that I want to say about the Metaphysics is I want to tell you the terms that Aristotle uses to refer to God in this work, The Metaphysics, okay? Because what I'm trying to say to you is that this book is an extended argument for the existence of God, God which is beyond nature, outside of the world, transcendent. But Aristotle has three terms, three names for God that pop up in this book. One of them, most basically, is just theos, T-H-E-O-S. We've talked about the Greek letter theta, and we've even talked about the word theos in the course. That's the first of Aristotle's names for God, theos, okay? Secondly, though, Aristotle refers to the deity in this book as the unmoved mover, the unmoved mover. Now, isn't that interesting? We just talked about how in the realm of physics or nature, that is the realm of motion, things moving, giraffes, falling rocks, human beings, bamboo shoots that grow. But God is not something that moves. For Aristotle, God or theos is the unmoved mover. So God does not move, but God causes other things to move. God is not moved, God moves other things, okay? So God is the unmoved mover or the prime mover, the first mover, okay? So number one, theos. Number two, the unmoved mover / prime mover or first mover. And then thirdly, Aristotle's third name for God that he uses in the Metaphysics is thought thinking itself. Now, y'all, these are very big topics that we're going to come to later on in the course. I just want to review them and just list them again because we're going to come back to them. We don't have time to develop them right now. But Aristotle's three names for God are number one, theos. Number two, the unmoved mover / the prime or first mover. Any of those will work. Unmoved mover, first mover, prime mover. And then thirdly, thought thinking itself. We're going to come back to this notion of thought thinking itself over and over again in the class. It's very important. But those are Aristotle's three words for God, three names for God that he comes up with in the Metaphysics, okay? Very good. Y'all, I want to do one more thing. Before I end this class. This is the first of about 4 lectures on Aristotle, and so it's kind of introductory, and I'm introducing some concepts. I want to do one more thing, and this is Roman numeral 4 on the notes, and I want to just introduce a topic that we're probably going to talk about for the next 2 weeks. This is really the main thing that I talk about when I talk about Aristotle, and that is what I call Aristotle's cosmological spectrum, or I call it the cosmological spectrum. I also call it the metaphysical spectrum. In fact, I'm gonna use that terminology, metaphysical spectrum. I will change the notes. Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, or you could call it Aristotle's metaphysical continuum, That word continuum and spectrum really mean the same thing, continuum and spectrum. Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, that's what I want to talk to you about just for a few moments. We will camp out on this for the coming 2 weeks. But I don't have a PowerPoint, sadly, in this class lecture, and I don't even have a marker board behind me. But I just want to introduce Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum like this. And I'm going to draw this thing for you over and over again. You've got a spectrum or a big line, and then you have an extreme on this end of the line and another extreme on this end of the line. And y'all, this line represents all of reality for Aristotle, okay? And on one extreme of the continuum, you have something that Plato talks about, because Plato talks about, oh, and I'm gonna change that up. On one end of the spectrum, you have something that Plato talks about, which is form. But Aristotle doesn't just talk about form, he talks about pure form. And that's one end of Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum. I wonder if anyone can guess what's on the other end of Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum. Do you remember how we said a few moments ago that for Aristotle, all objects in the natural world, or all objects in the world, are composites of form and matter, right? So a giraffe has form, the form of a giraffe, that's closely connected to the essence of a giraffe, or maybe the definition of a giraffe. We'll talk more about that. So you've got the form of the giraffe, but then you also have the matter of the giraffe: skin cells, carbon molecules, water, eyeballs. All of that is the matter of the giraffe. So all objects in the world for Aristotle are composites of form and matter. And what I'm saying to you is that that's kind of true in a way of everything that exists. On one end of the metaphysical spectrum, you have pure form, and on the other end of the metaphysical spectrum for Aristotle, you have prime matter, okay? Now, y'all, here's what's really interesting. Pure form, Aristotle says, is God. Now, do you remember what the three labels, the three names for God are for Aristotle? Theos, the prime mover or unmoved mover, and thought thinking itself. That's pure form on the one end of the metaphysical spectrum. On the other end of the metaphysical spectrum, you have prime matter. We're going to talk about this metaphysical spectrum over and over and over and again in our class, but I just want to do one more thing before I end this lecture, and that is, I want to say to you that the things that are closest to prime matter are the four elements. This is a dirt clod, and this is fire. You've got earth, wind, fire, and water are almost prime matter. We're going to talk more about this, but the point, you see, prime matter is utterly devoid of form. There's no form in prime matter. This is Genesis 1:2. Remember Genesis 1:2, and the earth was formless and void. I've also referred to that as a blooming, buzzing confusion. I've also referred to that as nihilism. That's prime matter. There's no form, there's no shape, there's no structure, there's no intelligibility. That's prime matter. And what I'm trying to say to you right now is that the four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water are almost prime matter, but they have a little bit of form, and so they're a little bit further toward pure form than prime matter is on the metaphysical spectrum. Does that make sense? So the four elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, are almost prime matter, but they have a little bit of form, and so they're not prime matter. They're almost prime matter, but not quite, okay? Now, something similar is true on this end of the metaphysical spectrum. The thing that is very close to pure form, but not quite there, is numbers. Numbers are almost pure form, okay? Numbers like a triangle or a group of four dots, or the numbers 1, 2, and 4 are almost pure form, but they have a little bit of matter in some sense. And so they're not pure form, but they're almost pure form, okay? So on this end of the spectrum, you've got pure form. On this end of the spectrum, you have prime matter. And then everything else that exists in the world is somewhere between the two extremes, somewhere between prime matter and pure form. Almost to the extreme of prime matter, you have earth, wind, fire, and water, the four elements that come from Empedocles. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have numbers or geometric shapes, mathematical entities that are almost pure form, but in some sense, they have a little bit of matter in some sense, okay? Y'all, this is Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum. This is Roman numeral 4 on today's lecture outline. And we will pick up with this and other things in our next lecture. And it's great to be with y'all today. May the force be with you and also with you.